Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, there's nothing you need to focus on, nothing you need to remember, and nowhere you need to go. This is a calm and gentle journey through the history of the Vikings, their quiet beginnings, their daily lives, and the world they slowly shaped. Everything here is told softly, with unhurried words and no sudden sounds or interruptions, so you can relax, unwind, or simply drift into sleep. Make yourself comfortable, and when you're ready, we'll begin. The story of the Vikings begins not with a sudden burst of dragon-proud ships appearing on foreign shores, but with something quieter, something deeper. To understand the Vikings, we must first understand the land that shaped them, and the people who lived there long before the first longship ever touched water. Picture the vast expanse of Scandinavia. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, lands of deep forests and endless coastlines. This is where the Norse people made their home, not for decades or even a single century, but for countless generations stretching back into the mists of time. The culture we call Norse existed for centuries before anyone ever heard the word Viking. These were farming people, fishing people, people who knew the rhythms of harsh northern seasons and the patient work of coaxing life from difficult soil. The ancestors of the Norse people arrived through waves of migration during the Iron Age, bringing with them diverse bloodlines and traditions. Genetic studies reveal this beautiful tapestry of ancestry, showing us that even in these early times, the Norse were never one single homogeneous group, but rather a blending of different peoples who found their way to these northern lands. Long before Rome fell, before the Viking Age ever began, the people of Scandinavia were already reaching outward into the world. As early as the 1st century before the Common Era, Norse traders were exchanging precious amber with the Roman Empire. Can you imagine those early merchants, traveling south with their golden stones, connecting their remote northern world to the great civilization of Rome? Trade routes existed, connections were being made, the Norse were never truly isolated. The land itself gave them gifts. Hidden in bogs across Scandinavia were deposits of bog iron, a natural resource that would prove crucial to their future. From these humble deposits, early Norse metalworkers developed their craft, learning to forge tools and weapons, building an expertise that would serve them well in the centuries to come. This wasn't sudden knowledge, it was accumulated slowly, carefully, passed from one generation to the next. Between the years 400 and 800 of the Common Era, something remarkable was happening. The Norse people were raising stones, rune stones, carved with their angular alphabet and inscribed with the names of their ancestors. These weren't grand monuments to kings and conquerors, not yet. These were family records, lineages preserved in stone, evidence of people who cared deeply about remembering who they were and where they came from. Each stone tells a story of connection, of memory, of the importance of knowing your place in the long chain of generations. In the far north, where the midnight sun paints the sky in summer and winter darkness stretches for months, the Norse people encountered and lived alongside the Sami people. This wasn't always a meeting of equals, but it was a meeting nonetheless, and from these interactions came influences that would shape Norse spiritual practices. Northern Norse shamanism absorbed elements from Sami traditions, creating something unique, something that blended the beliefs of different peoples into new forms of understanding the divine and the unseen world. The Norse people had their sacred places. Uppsala, in what is now Sweden, held a temple of legendary importance. This was a place tied to their mythic understanding of their homeland, where ritual and belief intertwined with the practical governance of the land. These sacred sites anchored their sense of identity, giving them a spiritual geography as important as the physical one they inhabited. Their language, Old Norse, connected them across the vast distances of Scandinavia. It was a North Germanic tongue, the ancestor of the modern languages spoken in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and beyond. When a Dane met a Norwegian, when a Swede traded with someone from the distant islands, they could understand each other. Language was a thread that bound together people who might never meet but who shared a common heritage. The geography of Scandinavia itself shaped the Norse destiny. That impossibly long coastline, those deep fjords cutting into the land like fingers of the sea reaching for the heart of the mountains, this landscape made the Norse people look to the water. Shipbuilding wasn't just a skill, it was a necessity. Maritime travel wasn't just an option, it was woven into the fabric of daily life. The sea was their highway, their connection, their opportunity. But life in Scandinavia was never easy. Good farmland was limited. Those long, dark winters and short growing seasons meant that feeding a family required constant effort and careful planning. As populations grew, reaching perhaps 200,000 to 500,000 people across Scandinavia by the year 800, the pressure increased. Where would the next generation farm? How would everyone be fed? These weren't abstract questions, they were matters of survival. Around the year 700, the climate itself seemed to turn against them. Shifts in weather patterns, cooler temperatures, harder conditions, these changes pressured some Norse communities to look southward, to wonder what lay beyond their familiar shores. Environmental pressure has driven human migration throughout history, and the Norse were no exception. Before the great kingdoms rose, Scandinavia was a patchwork of smaller territories. Petty kings ruled over limited domains. Chieftains commanded the loyalty of their local followers. Power was fragmented, local, personal. But slowly, gradually, some leaders began to consolidate power. Around 770, a king named Sigurd Ring managed to unify Swedish tribes, creating something larger than what had come before. This process of consolidation would continue, eventually producing the medieval kingdoms that we recognize today as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. For most Norse people, life was about the fundamentals. Farming the thin soil, fishing the cold waters, hunting in the forests, raising cattle, sheep, and goats. These activities had gone on for generations before anyone thought to sail away on a raid. These were the rhythms of Norse life, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Even as some would later become raiders and explorers, most Norse people remained farmers and fishermen throughout their lives. The emporia, the trading settlements, began to emerge before the year 800. Places like Hedeby became centers of exchange, where goods from distant lands changed hands, where different peoples met and mingled. These weren't fortified military bases, they were commercial hubs, evidence that trade and commerce were central to Norse society from early on. And what of that word, Viking? The term itself likely comes from an Old Norse word referring to a seaborne raid or the person undertaking such a raid. To go Viking was to go raiding. It wasn't an ethnic identity, it was an activity. Most Norse people never went on a Viking raid in their entire lives. But the word would come to define an entire age, capturing in one syllable the explosive energy that Norse seafarers would bring to the wider medieval world. This was the foundation, the deep origins of the Norse world. A world of diverse peoples, ancient traditions, challenging landscapes, and slowly accumulating skills. A world where trade existed alongside raiding, where spiritual practices blended and evolved, where family lineages were carved in stone so that future generations would remember. This was the world that produced the Vikings, but it was always so much more than just raiders in longships. It was a complete culture, with deep roots reaching back into the Iron Age and beyond. And from this foundation, something remarkable was about to emerge. The year 793 marks a moment that would echo through history. On a cold day in early summer, dragon-headed ships appeared off the coast of Northumbria, in what is now northern England. Their destination was a place of peace, a place of prayer, a place that had never known violence. The monastery at Lindisfarne. This is the raid that history remembers as the beginning, the opening of the Viking Age. Though Norse ships had surely sailed these waters before, though small-scale raiding may have occurred in earlier years, Lindisfarne was different. It was shocking. It was documented. It was remembered. The monks who survived wrote of the horror, and their words spread across Christian Europe like ripples across still water. Heathens from the north had descended upon a holy place, and nothing would ever quite be the same. But let us pause for a moment and consider what the Viking Age truly means. Historians typically place its boundaries from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century, roughly 300 years of intensified Norse activity across the known world. 3 centuries is a long time. Longer than the United States has existed as a nation. Longer than many empires have endured. This wasn't a brief explosion of violence, but rather a sustained period of expansion, exploration, settlement, and yes, raiding. The choice of 793 as a starting point is somewhat arbitrary, as these things always are when we try to divide the continuous flow of history into neat periods. But Lindisfarne serves as a useful marker, a symbolic beginning, because it announced to the wider world that something new was happening in the north. Those early raids followed a pattern, a logic. The Norse raiders were practical people. They sought targets that offered maximum reward with minimum risk. Monasteries fit this profile perfectly. These were centers of wealth, repositories of precious metals fashioned into crosses and reliquaries, of illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf and jeweled covers, of silver coins donated by the faithful. And yet, monasteries were not fortresses. They were not defended by warriors. Monks were men of peace, unprepared for violence, easy targets for men who had sailed far from home seeking fortune. Coastal sites, too, drew the attention of these early raiders. Places accessible by ship but far from royal armies or strong fortifications. The raiders could strike quickly, take what they could carry, and vanish back across the sea before any organized resistance could form. It was a form of warfare perfectly suited to the capabilities of Norse ships and the geography of northern Europe's coastlines. As the years passed, the raids grew bolder, larger, more organized. By the 830s and into the 840s, Norse fleets were ascending the rivers of Francia, what we now call France. Paris, the jewel of the Frankish realm, became a regular target. Year after year, the longships came. The Frankish annals, the historical records kept by Carolingian scribes, speak of these raids with a mixture of horror and grudging respect. They record fleets of enormous size, more than 200 ships in some cases, carrying thousands of warriors. Imagine the sight. 200 ships, their square sails filling with wind, their oars rising and falling in rhythm, coming up the Seine toward Paris. The sound alone must have been terrifying, the creak of wood, the splash of oars, the calls of the commanders echoing across the water. For the Frankish defenders, it must have seemed like the end of the world. And these raids were profitable, extraordinarily so. The Frankish rulers, descendants of Charlemagne, found themselves in an impossible position. They could fight, and sometimes they did, but the Norse raiders were mobile, unpredictable, and skilled in combat. Or they could pay. And pay they did. Massive quantities of Frankish silver flowed into Norse hands as tribute, as ransom, as the price of peace. This silver would circulate through Scandinavia, fueling trade, enriching chieftains, creating the wealth that would fund even more ambitious expeditions. But why did all of this happen when it did? Why not a century earlier or later? Part of the answer lies in the ships themselves, in the technological achievements that made these voyages possible. But part of the answer also lies in the climate, in forces beyond human control. Between roughly 900 and 1200, Europe experienced what scholars call the medieval climate optimum, a period of warmer temperatures. This warming made the northern seas more navigable, extended the sailing season, reduced the ice that could threaten ships. It made possible voyages that would have been far more dangerous in colder times. The Norse expansion wasn't just about human ambition and technological skill, it was also about favorable conditions, about nature opening a door that had previously been more firmly shut. Of course, dating these events with precision is challenging. The chronology of the Viking Age, especially its earlier phases, involves considerable debate among historians and archaeologists. The Frankish annals give us dates and numbers, but how accurate are they? Medieval chroniclers weren't always careful with numbers. 200 ships might have been an exact count, or it might have been a way of saying very many ships. The scribes who recorded these events were often writing years after the fact, sometimes copying from earlier sources, sometimes exaggerating for dramatic effect or to excuse military failures. Archaeology helps us fill in the gaps. The remains of fortifications built to resist Norse attacks. Hoards of silver coins buried in times of danger and never retrieved. The traces of burned settlements. These material remains don't lie in quite the same way that written sources might, but they also don't tell us exact dates or precise numbers. The truth of the Viking Age emerges from the careful comparison of written records and physical evidence, each correcting and complementing the other. What we can say with confidence is that something profound shifted in the late 8th century. The Norse people, who had been primarily farmers and traders, who had been content to work their difficult northern lands, began to look outward with new ambition. They had always been skilled sailors, but now they began to use those skills not just for fishing and coastal trading, but for raiding, for conquest, for settlement in foreign lands. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 was not an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a pattern, the first note in a symphony of expansion that would eventually carry Norse people to Iceland, Greenland, even the shores of North America. It would see them establish kingdoms in Ireland and England, create a Norse duchy in northern France, serve as elite guards to Byzantine emperors, and trade along rivers that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. But in 793, none of that was yet foreseeable. In 793, there was simply a monastery on a holy island, and ships appearing from the north, and violence erupting in a place that had known only peace. The monks who survived would write their accounts in shaking hands, and those accounts would spread, carrying news of the Northmen, the Vikings, who had come from the sea like a sudden storm. The Viking Age had begun. And for the next 3 centuries, the world would never quite forget the sight of those distinctive sails on the horizon, would never quite lose the fear of what might come when the dragon-headed ships made landfall. This was the opening, and there was so much more yet to come. When we think of Vikings, we often picture warriors on longships, but that image, vivid as it is, represents only a small part of Norse life. For every man who ever went raiding, there were dozens who never left their home valleys. For every dramatic battle, there were countless ordinary days of work and rest, of meals shared and stories told. To truly understand the Norse people, we must understand how they lived at home, in their own communities, surrounded by family and neighbors. Norse society, like most societies of its time, was divided into layers, classes that defined your place in the world from birth. At the top stood the nobles, the jarls, and wealthy landowners who commanded respect and wielded power. Below them were the free farmers, the backbone of Norse society, independent householders who worked their own land. And at the bottom, hardest to see in the historical record but impossible to ignore, were the thralls, the enslaved people whose labor supported the entire system. Slavery was woven into the fabric of Norse society in ways that may be uncomfortable for us to contemplate. In Iceland, studies suggest that thralls may have comprised as much as 30% of the population. These were often war captives, people seized during raids and brought back to Scandinavia in chains. They performed the hardest labor, clearing land, building walls, working from dawn until long after dark. They served in households, doing the endless work of daily life. And they could be bought and sold, traded like any other commodity, their humanity reduced to their usefulness. We must sit with this reality for a moment. The Norse world that produced beautiful art and epic poetry, that valued honor and courage, also held human beings in bondage. History rarely offers us simple heroes and villains, only complicated people living in complicated times. Most Norse people, however, were neither nobles nor slaves, but something in between. They were the carls, the free farmers, the freeholders who formed the heart of Norse communities. These men owned their land, or at least held it under reasonable terms. They grew grain, barley and rye primarily, crops that could survive the short northern growing season. They kept livestock, cattle for dairy and meat, sheep for wool, pigs and goats. Agriculture in Scandinavia was always a mixed affair, combining several strategies because relying on any single source of food was too risky in such an uncertain climate. These free farmers had rights and responsibilities. They attended the thing, the local assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes, make laws, and decide matters affecting the community. They could bear arms. They had a voice, a place in society, a stake in how things were run. This wasn't democracy as we understand it, but neither was it simple tyranny. There was a social contract, however rough, between the different levels of Norse society. Home, for most Norse families, was a longhouse. Picture a narrow building, stretched out like a ship lying on its side, built of timber in forested areas or of turf where wood was scarce. At the center, providing warmth and light, burned the hearth. This fire was the literal heart of the home, never allowed to go completely out, the source of heat during those long, dark northern winters. Around the hearth, life unfolded. Meals were prepared. Stories were told. Work was done by firelight when the sun set early and rose late. These longhouses were communal spaces. Privacy as we understand it barely existed. The family lived together, slept together in the same lodge room, shared every aspect of daily life. Sometimes animals might shelter at one end of the building during the worst winter weather. The smell of smoke, of cooking, of animals and people living in close quarters, this was the atmosphere of home. Food defined the rhythm of life. The Norse diet was practical, built around what could be grown or gathered in their harsh environment. Bread and porridge from grain formed the foundation. Meat, when available, pork, mutton, beef, game from the forests. Fish, both fresh and preserved, incredibly important in coastal communities. Dairy products, milk, cheese, butter, skyr. And when the brief summer came, there were fruits and berries to gather, precious sweet flavors to enjoy while they lasted and to preserve for the darker months ahead. Meals were simple but sustaining. The wealthy might eat better, might have more meat, might enjoy imported luxuries, but the fundamental diet remained similar across social classes. Everyone ate what the land provided, what could be coaxed from the soil and sea through hard labor and careful planning. Clothing, too, was practical above all else. Wool dominated, because sheep could survive in Scandinavia and wool kept you warm even when wet. Linen for undergarments and summer wear. The quality of the fabric, the fineness of the weave, the richness of the colors, these indicated status. Natural dyes produced browns and grays, yellows and reds. The brightest colors, the most even dyes, required wealth and access to trade goods. And jewelry, especially silver and gold jewelry, announced to the world that the wearer had means, had connections, had worth. What surprises many people is how much the Norse cared about grooming, about personal appearance. The stereotype of the filthy barbarian melts away when we examine the archaeological record. Combs are everywhere in Norse sites, carefully crafted from bone or antler. Tweezers for removing unwanted hair. Ear cleaners. These weren't vanity items, or perhaps they were, but that's not a criticism. The Norse people cared about how they looked, about cleanliness, about presenting themselves well. They had saunas, called elding, heated spaces where steam and heat would cleanse the body. Weekly bathing was common, far more frequent than many of their European contemporaries managed. The stereotype of the dirty Viking was largely invented by their enemies, by Christian chroniclers who wanted to portray the Norse as savage and uncivilized. The reality was rather different. Entertainment mattered too. Long winter nights had to be filled somehow. Dice games were popular, games of chance played with knucklebones or carved pieces. These weren't just idle pastimes, they were social activities, ways to build relationships, to compete in friendly ways, to pass the hours when darkness trapped everyone indoors. But the most important entertainment, the most valued, was storytelling. In a society without widespread literacy, without books or writing beyond simple runic inscriptions, memory and oral tradition carried the weight of culture. The old stories were told and retold, myths of the gods, legends of ancient heroes, accounts of family history. Poetry was composed and recited, verses crafted with intricate alliteration and complex metaphors. Music, played on simple instruments, accompanied the words. A skilled storyteller was valued almost as highly as a skilled warrior, because they preserved what made the Norse people who they were. Life was hard and often short. The average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years. Many children died young. Women faced the dangers of childbirth without modern medicine. Injuries that we would consider minor could become infected and fatal. Disease swept through communities with no understanding of how illness spread. Skeletal remains show evidence of leprosy, of arthritis, of the wear and tear of hard physical labor on bodies that had no choice but to keep working. In such a world, family became everything. Your kin were your protection, your support, your safety net. If someone wronged you, your family would stand with you. If you achieved something great, your family's reputation rose with yours. Legal disputes were often settled by families negotiating with families, by compensation paid from one kin group to another. Being alone, being without family ties, was one of the worst fates imaginable. Fosterage, the practice of sending children to be raised by other families, strengthened these networks. A boy might be sent to live with his mother's brother, learning skills and forming bonds that would serve him throughout his life. These weren't abandoned children, they were investments in relationships, creating connections that crossed households and even regions. The jarls, the nobles, understood the importance of these bonds. They hosted feasts, grand gatherings where food and drink flowed freely, where gifts were given, where oaths of loyalty might be sworn. These weren't just parties, they were political events, opportunities to build alliances, to demonstrate wealth and generosity, to remind everyone of where power resided. A jarl who failed to host proper feasts, who was seen as stingy or inhospitable, would soon find his influence waning. Women's roles in this society deserve particular attention. When men went trading or raiding or exploring, often away for months at a time, someone had to keep the farms running. That someone was usually the woman of the household. She managed the workers, made decisions about planting and harvest, handled disputes, maintained the property. This wasn't ceremonial authority, it was real power, real responsibility. Norse women could own property in their own right. Widows, especially, could become quite powerful if they inherited substantial estates and chose not to remarry. The legal codes gave women certain protections and rights that were unusual for medieval Europe. This wasn't equality as we would define it. Men still held most formal power, still dominated public life. But neither were women simply property or decorations. They had agency, they had roles that mattered, they could influence events. We see this in the burials. When archaeologists excavate Norse graves, they find grave goods that reflect the life of the deceased. Men are often buried with weapons, with tools associated with male activities. Women are buried with jewelry, with textile tools, with items connected to household management. These gender-specific grave goods tell us how the Norse understood roles and identity, how they believed the dead should be equipped for whatever came next. Daily life in the Norse world was a mixture of hard work and simple pleasures, of rigid social hierarchies and surprising areas of flexibility, of harsh realities and cherished traditions. It was a life shaped by climate and geography, by the ever-present knowledge that winter was coming and would be long and dark. It was a life where family meant everything, where reputation could be more valuable than silver, where the stories told around the fire on winter nights preserved the identity of an entire people. This was home. This was the foundation beneath all the raiding and trading and exploring. This was what Norse people returned to after their voyages, what they remembered when they were far from their own shores. The longhouse with its central fire. The family gathered around it. The smell of cooking food and the sound of familiar voices. The comfort of being among your own people, in your own place, part of something larger than yourself. And on those long winter nights, when the wind howled outside and the darkness seemed endless, there was always another story to tell, another song to sing, another way to remember who you were and where you came from. That, perhaps more than anything, was what it meant to be Norse. In the Norse world, justice was not something handed down from a distant king or enforced by professional police and judges. Justice was something the community created together, something negotiated and decided by free people gathering in the open air. It was messy, imperfect, often violent, but it was theirs. To understand how the Norse governed themselves, we must set aside many of our modern assumptions about how law and order should work. Power in Norse society was distributed in complex ways. Kings existed, yes, and their power grew over time, but they were never absolute monarchs in the way we might imagine. Local chieftains held real authority over their territories, commanding the loyalty of the farmers and warriors around them. But even chieftains couldn't simply decree whatever they wished. They had to work within a system that gave voice to free men, that recognized the importance of consensus and community agreement. At the heart of this system was the thing, the assembly. The word itself, in Old Norse, simply means a gathering, a meeting, but it came to mean something more specific, a gathering for the purpose of law and governance. Things met at regular intervals, in established places. Free men would travel to attend, sometimes from considerable distances, because the thing was where decisions were made that affected everyone's lives. These weren't comfortable indoor meetings. The thing met outdoors, in designated spaces that often had natural features lending them importance, a particular field, a spot near a prominent rock or hill. Men would stand or sit on the ground, gathering in the open air regardless of weather. There was something deliberately public about this arrangement, something that emphasized that the law belonged to everyone present, not to any single ruler. The Icelandic Althing, established around 930, stands as perhaps the most famous example of these assemblies. Iceland had no king, no single ruler at all for centuries. Instead, the Althing served as the central institution of Icelandic governance. Once a year, in midsummer, free men would journey to Thingvellir, the assembly plains, from all across the island. For 2 weeks, Iceland's scattered population would come together to settle disputes, make laws, forge alliances, trade goods, arrange marriages, and simply see people they might not encounter for another year. The Althing is sometimes called one of the world's oldest parliaments, and while that comparison requires careful qualifications, there's truth in it. This was representative governance of a sort, a gathering where decisions were made collectively rather than by royal decree. It wasn't democracy in our modern sense. Women didn't participate, slaves had no voice, and wealth and status greatly influenced outcomes. But it was a system that required participation, that gave free men a stake in their own governance. One of the most remarkable aspects of Norse law was how it was preserved. In the early period, before laws were written down, everything existed in oral form. This might seem impossibly primitive to us, accustomed as we are to vast legal codes and written statutes. How could anyone remember all the laws? How could the system function without written records? The answer lay in the law speaker, a person specifically designated to memorize and recite the law. This was no minor task. The law speaker was required to know the entire legal code, and at each assembly, he would recite a portion of it. Over a 3-year cycle, he would recite the complete law, 1/3 each year. This constant repetition, this regular public recitation, kept the law alive in communal memory. Imagine the skill required. The law speaker had to commit to memory not just the general principles but the specific details, the exceptions, the precedents. His memory became the law itself. If a dispute arose about what the law said, people turned to the law speaker. His word carried enormous authority because he was the living repository of legal tradition. Of course, this system had its vulnerabilities. Memory can fail. Laws recited can shift slightly over time, words changing, meanings drifting. But there was also a kind of flexibility built into oral law, an ability to adapt gradually to changing circumstances without requiring formal amendment processes. The Norse legal system was living and breathing, evolving organically even as it claimed to preserve ancient tradition. In Norway, the picture was somewhat different. Regional things had their own law codes, gradually codified as literacy spread. The Gulathing, one of the oldest Norwegian assemblies, had its law code dating back to around 930. The Frostathing, another major assembly, developed laws that specifically regulated trade, reflecting the importance of commerce to Norse society. In Sweden, the Uppland laws addressed social concerns, even going so far as to ban infanticide, suggesting that this practice existed and was controversial enough to require explicit prohibition. But law codes, whether oral or written, are only as good as the willingness of people to follow them and the mechanisms to enforce them. In the absence of police forces or strong central government, how did the Norse maintain order? The answer lies partly in the concept of honor and reputation. In Norse society, your reputation was everything. To be known as honorable, as trustworthy, as brave and generous, this was wealth that couldn't be taken from you. Conversely, to be seen as dishonorable, as a liar or a coward, could make your life unbearable. Social pressure was a powerful force in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. When wrongs occurred, as they inevitably did, the law provided mechanisms for resolution. The system of wergild, compensation payments for injuries or death, was central to Norse justice. If someone killed your brother, you could demand payment. The amount was scaled according to the status of the victim. A nobleman's life was worth more in wergild than a farmer's, which was worth more than a slave's. This might seem unjust to modern sensibilities, but it reflected the hierarchical nature of Norse society. These compensation payments served an important purpose. They provided a way to resolve conflicts without endless cycles of revenge. If your kinsman was killed, you naturally wanted vengeance. But accepting wergild, publicly and with witnesses, formally ended the dispute. Both honor and law were satisfied. Of course, not all disputes ended so neatly. Feuds could erupt from killings, from insults, from perceived disrespect. These feuds might last for generations, families nursing grievances and seeking opportunities for revenge. The sagas are full of such stories, long, complicated feuds where violence answered violence, where the original cause of conflict became almost irrelevant compared to the accumulated weight of injury and counter-injury. Sometimes, when negotiation failed and tempers ran too hot for peaceful resolution, there was Hongang, the duel. Two men would meet, often on a small island or a marked-off space, and fight with weapons until one yielded or died. This wasn't just lawless violence, it was a legally recognized way to settle certain kinds of disputes. The idea was that the gods, fate, or simple justice would favor the righteous party. Whether that actually happened in practice is another question entirely, but the system provided a release valve for conflicts that might otherwise tear communities apart. The harshest punishment the law could impose was outlawry. To be made an outlaw was to be expelled from society's protection. Anyone could kill an outlaw without legal consequences. The outlaw couldn't seek help from the law, couldn't participate in assemblies, couldn't conduct legal business. In a society where community membership was essential for survival, outlawry was a kind of social death. There were gradations to outlawry. Lesser outlawry might last 3 years, a terrible punishment, certainly, but survivable. If you could find somewhere to live, some way to sustain yourself outside your home community, you might return after your term ended. Full outlawry was permanent. You were gone forever, cast out with no hope of return. This was reserved for the most serious offenses, for crimes that so outraged community standards that the perpetrator could never be accepted back. Some outlaws fled to Iceland or other frontier regions, places where a man's past might not follow him quite so closely. Some lived as bandits, surviving through theft and violence. Some simply died, unable to survive without the support system that society provided. The sagas tell us of famous outlaws, men who became legends through their time outside the law, but for every famous outlaw, there must have been many more whose names are lost, who simply vanished from the historical record. The Thing system and Norse law more broadly worked because enough people chose to make them work. There was no army of enforcers standing ready to impose the law's will. Compliance was voluntary in the sense that it depended on social consensus. But the pressure to comply was intense. Your reputation, your family's reputation, your ability to conduct business and arrange marriages and maintain alliances, all of this depended on being seen as someone who respected the law and the community's judgment. Over time, as kings consolidated power, the balance shifted somewhat. Royal authority grew stronger. Kings appointed officials, raised armies, built power structures that didn't depend quite so much on community consensus. The thing system didn't disappear, but it became less central, more of a local institution operating within a larger framework of royal governance. But in the earlier period, in the height of the Viking Age, the thing was where power really resided. Not in the king's hall, not in the hands of warriors and raiders, but in those outdoor gatherings of free men arguing about law and justice, negotiating compensation for wrongs, deciding who belonged in the community and who should be cast out. It was a rough justice, shaped by the values of a warrior society, marked by violence and inequality. Women had no formal voice. Slaves had no rights at all. Might influenced outcomes more than modern people would consider just. But it was also a system that recognized the importance of community participation, that gave free men a say in their own governance, that tried to channel the inevitable conflicts of human society into mechanisms other than endless violence. The law speaker would stand before the assembly and recite the old laws, his voice carrying across the gathering. Free men would listen, would remember, would debate how those laws applied to the specific cases before them. Compensation would be negotiated, oaths would be sworn, judgments would be rendered. And when the thing ended and everyone returned home, they carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something larger than themselves, that they were part of a system that, however imperfect, was theirs. This was Norse governance, communal, oral, honor-bound, and violent when necessary. It was law without lawyers, order without police, justice negotiated among free people who understood that the alternative to some kind of legal system was chaos. And for centuries, it worked well enough to hold together a scattered, independent-minded people across the vast distances of the Norse world. If you were to identify the single piece of technology that defined the Viking Age, that made everything else possible, it would be the ship. The Norse longship was more than just a means of transportation. It was a work of art, a feat of engineering, and a tool that opened the world. Without their ships, the Norse people would have remained farmers and fishermen in Scandinavia. With them, they became Vikings, travelers, traders, raiders, explorers who reached farther than perhaps even they imagined possible. The longship was a masterpiece of design, refined over generations until every element served multiple purposes, until nothing was wasted. These were clinker-built vessels, meaning their wooden planks overlapped like shingles on a roof, each plank fastened to the one below with iron rivets. This method created a hull that was both strong and flexible, able to bend and twist with the waves rather than fighting against them. In rough seas, a longship would seem almost alive, moving with the water in a way that rigid construction could never achieve. The planks themselves came from carefully selected timber, usually oak for the keel and lower planks where strength was paramount, then pine or other woods higher up where weight mattered more than sheer strength. Finding the right trees, felling them at the right time, splitting them along the grain to preserve their natural strength, this was specialized knowledge passed from master shipbuilders to apprentices, accumulated over lifetimes and generations. Iron rivets held everything together, thousands of them in a single ship. Each rivet represented work at the forge, the bloomery fires where Norse smiths heated bog iron until it could be shaped and worked. The quality of these rivets mattered enormously. A single failed rivet at the wrong moment could mean disaster. Norse metalworking had to be reliable, consistent, good enough to stake your life on. The hull would be waterproofed with tar, coating the wood to keep the sea out. Even so, longships leaked. Water would seep in slowly but constantly, requiring someone to bail regularly. This wasn't a flaw in the design but simply the reality of wooden ships. The Norse accepted it, incorporated it into their routines, knew that keeping the ship afloat was an active, ongoing process. Above the hull rose the mast, a single tall spar that on larger vessels might reach 35 feet in height. From this mast hung a single square sail, simple in concept but remarkably effective in execution. The sail was woven from wool, sometimes requiring the wool from hundreds of sheep to create one sail. It would be reinforced with leather at stress points, adjusted with a complex system of ropes and blocks that allowed the crew to make the most of whatever wind they had. These ships were fast when the wind was favorable. They could achieve speeds that would surprise modern sailors. But they were also versatile. When the wind died or came from an unfavorable direction, the crew could lower the sail and take to the oars. A ship like the Gokstad vessel, one of the best preserved longships we have, had 32 oars, meaning 16 rowers per side. With a crew of roughly 22 men, the ship could maintain rowing for extended periods by rotating who was at the oars. The shallow draft of longships, the small depth of hull below the waterline, was perhaps their most revolutionary feature. These ships could navigate in remarkably shallow water, could venture up rivers that other vessels couldn't approach, could beach directly on shorelines without need for docks or harbors. This gave Norse raiders and traders an extraordinary advantage. They could appear where no one expected ships to go, could strike at targets far inland, could explore rivers deep into continental Europe and Russia. The Osberg ship, another famous archaeological find, shows us the artistic heights that Norse shipbuilding could reach. This was a burial ship, ornately decorated with elaborate carvings. Dragon heads adorned the prow and stern, fierce and beautiful at once. The ship itself was a statement of wealth and status, a vessel fit to carry a noble person into the afterlife. The craftsmanship visible in the Osberg ship reminds us that for the Norse, ships weren't merely functional tools. They were objects of pride, worthy of the finest decoration their artisans could provide. Not all Norse ships were sleek longships built for speed and warfare. The Nor was different, broader, deeper, built for cargo rather than combat. These were the merchant vessels, the workhorses of Norse trade networks. A Nor couldn't match a longship for speed, couldn't maneuver as nimbly, couldn't beach as easily in shallow water. But it could carry far more cargo, could ride out rougher weather, could make the long voyages to Iceland and Greenland with holds full of supplies, livestock, and settlers. The Nor and the longship represent two different applications of the same fundamental shipbuilding knowledge. The Norse understood that different purposes required different designs, and they had mastered both. They could build a raiding vessel that could outrun anything on the sea, or a cargo ship that could carry tons of goods across the North Atlantic. This versatility in shipbuilding reflected a deep understanding of their craft. But ships were only one expression of Norse technological skill. Their smiths produced far more than just rivets. Norse metalwork ranged from the purely functional to the exquisitely beautiful. Weapons, of course, swords, axes, spearheads, all requiring precise work to create blades that would hold an edge and not shatter in use. Tools for farming and woodworking. But also jewelry, brooches that fastened cloaks, arm rings that proclaimed status and wealth, intricate pieces that combined metalworking with artistic vision. The best Norse metalwork shows remarkable sophistication. Pattern welding techniques created blades with distinctive wavy patterns, combining different qualities of iron and steel to produce weapons that were both strong and flexible. Silver and gold were worked into jewelry using techniques like filigree and granulation, creating pieces of surprising delicacy. These weren't crude barbarians hammering out rough tools. These were master craftsmen producing work that stands comparison with anything their contemporaries in other cultures were creating. Wood carving was another art form that the Norse elevated to extraordinary levels. Ships might bear elaborate carvings, but so too did buildings, doorways, household objects. The animal styles that characterize Norse art, creatures that twist and intertwine, that seem to transform from one form to another, appear carved into wood with remarkable skill. The boar style, one of several distinct Norse artistic traditions, featured intricate interlace patterns, ribbons, and shapes flowing into each other in designs that seem almost impossible to have been carved by hand into hard wood. Other materials offered opportunities for craft work as well. Bone, antler, and horn became combs, essential items in a society that valued grooming. Pins for fastening clothing. Decorative items. Gaming pieces. The archaeological record is rich with these objects, testimony to the skill of Norse artisans in working materials that required patience and precision. Glass beads were imported in massive quantities, coming from workshops in other parts of Europe and even from as far away as the Middle East. These colorful beads were strung into necklaces, sewn onto clothing, valued for their beauty and their exotic origins. The Norse didn't make their own glass on any significant scale, but they enthusiastically incorporated it into their material culture. Even something as simple as travel in winter required technological solutions. Bone ice skates, made from animal leg bones, allowed people to move across frozen lakes and rivers. These weren't recreational items but practical tools for getting around when snow and ice covered the landscape. The Norse adapted to their environment with whatever worked, whatever helped them survive and thrive in challenging conditions. Agricultural technology advanced as well, though more slowly than shipbuilding. The cross-plow, an improvement over earlier designs, made farming somewhat more efficient. Every small advantage mattered when growing seasons were short and good land was limited. The Norse couldn't transform their agricultural productivity the way they revolutionized maritime technology, but they worked constantly to improve what they could. Navigation presented particular challenges. How did Norse sailors cross vast stretches of open ocean without compasses, without detailed charts, without any of the tools that later mariners would consider essential? The answer combines observation, experience, and perhaps some tools we're not entirely certain about. Landmarks worked well for coastal navigation. Norse sailors knew their home waters intimately, could recognize specific features of coastline, could read the patterns of currents and the behavior of seabirds to know where land lay. The sun and stars provided direction when sky was visible. The Norse understood that certain stars remained fixed while others moved, could read the night sky well enough to maintain course. In more open waters, away from landmarks, navigation became more difficult. Some sources suggest the use of sun compasses, simple devices that could help determine direction based on the sun's shadow. Archaeological finds of circular wooden discs with markings have been tentatively identified as such instruments, though their exact use remains somewhat speculative. Then there are the sunstones mentioned in sagas, crystals that supposedly could locate the sun even through clouds or fog. Some researchers have proposed that certain minerals, like calcite or cordierite, could theoretically serve this function through their optical properties. Others remain skeptical, pointing out that the saga references might be metaphorical or that practical use would have been extremely difficult. The debate continues, a reminder that there's still much we don't fully understand about Norse seamanship. What we can say with certainty is that Norse navigators were extraordinarily skilled at reading the environment, wave patterns, the color and temperature of water, the presence of certain seabirds or sea creatures, cloud formations. The Norse developed an almost intuitive sense of where they were and where they were going, accumulated over years of experience at sea. All of this technology, all of these skills, worked together to enable the Norse expansion. The ships carried warriors and traders. The metalwork provided weapons and goods for exchange. The wood carving decorated and beautified. The navigational knowledge guided journeys across unknown waters. Each element supported the others, creating a technological foundation that made the Viking Age possible. When we look at a Norse longship today, preserved in a museum or reproduced by modern craftsmen, we're looking at the culmination of centuries of accumulated knowledge. Every curve of the hull, every placement of a rivet, every detail of construction represents decisions made and refined over generations. The ship is elegant because it's efficient, beautiful because every element serves a purpose. The Norse weren't scientists or engineers in the modern sense. They didn't write technical manuals or theoretical treatises. Their knowledge was practical, embedded in the work itself, transmitted through apprenticeship and example. A young man learning shipbuilding didn't study abstract principles. He watched, he practiced, he gradually absorbed the skills until they became second nature. And yet, working without formal theory, without written records, Norse craftsmen produced ships that astonished their contemporaries and still impress us today. They created metalwork of remarkable sophistication, wood carving of great beauty, navigational methods that worked across vast distances. This was technology as craft, knowledge expressed through skilled hands rather than written words. The sound of hammers ringing in smithies. The smell of fresh-cut wood in shipyards. The sight of a new sail being raised for the first time, catching the wind and pulling a ship forward. These were the experiences that defined Norse technological culture. Not formal, not institutional, but effective. So effective that Norse ships carried their builders to the ends of the known world and beyond. When we speak of Vikings, the image that most often comes to mind is of raiders, fierce warriors appearing from the sea, bringing violence and terror to unsuspecting communities. This image isn't entirely wrong, but it's incomplete. Not every Norse person was a raider. Most, in fact, never went on a raid in their entire lives. But warfare, the culture of the warrior, the importance of martial skill and courage, these were woven deeply into Norse society in ways that shaped everything, even for those who never lifted a weapon in anger. The raiding parties that became the terror of medieval Europe were remarkably effective military operations. They relied on speed, surprise, and the extraordinary capabilities of Norse ships. A raiding party might appear at dawn, striking a monastery or coastal settlement before anyone could organize resistance. By the time word spread and help could arrive, the raiders would be gone, their ships already far down the coast or out to sea, loaded with whatever they could carry. These weren't random acts of chaos. They were calculated operations led by men who understood risk and reward, who could assess a target's defenses and wealth, who knew when to press an attack and when to withdraw. The most successful raid leaders became wealthy and famous, their reputations drawing more warriors to their banners for future expeditions. The weapons these warriors carried tell us much about Norse martial culture. Spears were ubiquitous, the most common weapon for both hunting and warfare. A spear required less metal than a sword, was effective in formation fighting, could be thrown or used in hand-to-hand combat. Every free man might own a spear. Axes, too, were common, practical tools that doubled as weapons, though battle axes were often larger and more specialized than those used for splitting wood. Swords occupied a special place. A good sword represented a significant investment of resources and skilled labor. Pattern-welded blades with their distinctive appearance, hilts decorated with precious metals and intricate designs, these weren't just weapons but treasures. Swords had names. They were passed down through families, given as precious gifts, carried with pride. To own a fine sword marked you as a man of substance, a warrior of note. Defense was more variable. The round wooden shield, painted in bright colors and bound with leather or metal, was standard equipment. Light enough to carry and maneuver, strong enough to deflect or catch weapons, the shield was the primary means of protecting yourself in combat. Mail shirts, made from thousands of interlocking iron rings, provided excellent protection against cuts and slashes, but they were expensive and heavy. Only wealthy warriors wore full mail. Others might have a mail collar or rely on padded leather armor, or simply their shield and their skill. The popular image of Viking warriors wearing horned helmets is, unfortunately, a complete fabrication. It's a 19th century romantic invention with no basis in historical reality. Real Norse helmets were practical metal caps, sometimes with face guards or nasal bars to protect the nose, designed to deflect blows rather than catch them. Horns on a helmet would be worse than useless in actual combat. They'd give an opponent something to grab, would add weight without providing protection, would be a liability in every way. For close combat, many warriors carried a seax, a large knife or short sword that could be drawn quickly when fighting became too cramped for longer weapons. These were backup weapons, but important ones, the kind of tool that might save your life when everything went wrong. The sagas speak of berserkers, warriors who fought in a kind of trance state, seemingly immune to pain or fear. These men fought without shields, throwing themselves into battle with reckless fury. Some modern scholars suggest this might have involved ingesting substances that altered consciousness, while others think it might have been a trained psychological state, a form of controlled rage that made a warrior terrifyingly effective but also unpredictable and difficult to manage. Ulfhedna, wolf warriors, wore pelts of wolves and were said to channel the ferocity of those animals. Whether these were distinct warrior cults or simply different names for similar phenomena remains debated. What seems clear is that Norse culture recognized and valued certain men who could enter altered states in combat, who fought with a wildness that both inspired their companions and terrified their enemies. Raven banners, standards depicting Odin's sacred birds, flew above Norse armies. The saga accounts suggest these banners had prophetic qualities. If the raven seemed to flutter, victory would follow. Like much of Norse culture, warfare was interwoven with religion and belief, with the sense that fate and the gods took interest in human battles. Successful raids brought wealth home. Silver, the universal measure of value, could be looted from churches and monasteries where it had been fashioned into sacred objects. Trade goods, fine cloth, weapons, anything portable and valuable. Slaves, perhaps the most tragic commodity, captured and brought back to work Norse farms and households. And prestige, successful raid leaders gained reputations that attracted more followers, that allowed them to arrange advantageous marriages, that elevated their family's standing. But raiding evolved. What began as small parties of warriors seeking quick profits gradually transformed into something more ambitious. By the mid-9th century, Norse forces were no longer content with hit-and-run raids. They began to campaign, to spend entire seasons or even years in foreign lands, establishing bases, extorting tribute, conquering territory. The logistics of these campaigns were considerable. Ships could carry perhaps 3 months of rations, dried fish and meat, hard bread, water or beer in barrels. After that, an army had to live off the land, had to take what it needed from the surrounding countryside. This made the Norse forces mobile but also dependent on continued success, on finding enough food and supplies to sustain themselves. In 865, what the Anglo-Saxon chronicles called the Great Heathen Army arrived in England. This wasn't a raiding party but an army of conquest, led by legendary figures whose names echo through history. They moved through Anglo-Saxon England like a storm, conquering kingdoms, destroying others, forcing the proud English kings to their knees or into graves. For 13 years this army campaigned, until finally Alfred of Wessex, the only English king who could claim to have stemmed the tide, defeated the Norse leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in 878. But even in defeat, Guthrum extracted remarkable terms. He would convert to Christianity, yes, but he would retain control of vast territories in eastern England, lands that would become known as the Danelaw, where Norse law and Norse customs would hold sway for generations. Later battles would achieve their own fame. The Battle of Maldon in 991 would inspire one of the great works of Anglo-Saxon poetry, a account of English warriors choosing to stand and fight even when defeat seemed certain. The poem preserves for us something of what it must have felt like to face Norse warriors in battle, the courage required, the awareness of almost certain death, the determination to die well rather than flee. The tribute demanded by Norse armies staggered the imagination. Dangerald, the payments made to buy off Norse attacks, totaled thousands of pounds of silver over the years. 7,000 pounds of silver or more, an almost incomprehensible sum, flowing from England into Scandinavian hands. Some historians argue this massive influx of wealth fundamentally transformed Norse society, accelerating the development of urban centers and the consolidation of royal power. But increasingly, Norse leaders sought something more permanent than plunder or tribute. They wanted land, the security of holding territory rather than constantly moving. This shift transformed raiders into settlers, warriors into farmers and townspeople. Strongholds established for military purposes evolved into trading centers and towns. York, once a small English city, became Jorvik under Norse rule, a thriving urban center that blended Norse and English cultures. The Norse who settled in conquered lands didn't simply displace the existing population. Instead, over time, they intermarried, adopted local customs even as they maintained some of their own, created hybrid cultures that were neither purely Norse nor purely English or Irish or French. The descendants of fierce raiders became merchants, craftsmen, farmers, indistinguishable in many ways from the people their grandfathers had come to conquer. Not all Norse military ventures succeeded. At Stamford Bridge in 1066, the Norwegian King Harald Hardrada led an army into England, seeking to claim the throne. He met Harold Godwinson's English army in a battle that became legendary. The Norse forces, caught by surprise and perhaps without their armor, fought with desperate courage but were destroyed. Harald Hardrada, one of the last great Norse warrior kings, fell in the battle. It marked in many ways the end of an era, the closing of the Viking Age itself. Just weeks later, Harold Godwin's son would face another invasion, this time by William of Normandy, himself descended from Norse settlers who had carved out a duchy in northern France generations earlier. At Hastings, the English king would fall, and England would pass into Norman hands. The Vikings hadn't conquered England, but the grandsons of Vikings had, a final ironic twist to the story of Norse expansion. Warfare shaped Norse culture profoundly. The values of courage, loyalty to your war leader, skill in combat, these weren't abstract ideals but practical necessities for men who might find themselves in battle. Young men trained with weapons, practiced with shields, developed the strength and stamina that combat required. Those who showed promise might be invited to join a warrior band, a great honor that offered opportunities for wealth and glory but also carried very real risks of injury and death. The warrior ethos influenced even those who never fought. Poetry celebrated martial valor. Stories told around fires featured heroes who faced impossible odds without flinching. Social status accrued to those who demonstrated courage. Even in old age, men would recall their moments of bravery in battle as the defining experiences of their lives. Yet we must be careful not to romanticize this. Warfare was brutal, short, and horrifically violent. Men died screaming, bleeding out from terrible wounds, crying for mothers or wives as their lives ended far from home. Communities that suffered raids were traumatized, their people killed or enslaved, their treasures stolen, their sense of security shattered. The glory of battle, so praised in poetry, came at an enormous human cost. The evolution from raiding to settlement, from plunder to tribute to permanent conquest, shows how Norse society itself was changing. The wild warriors who terrified Europe in the late 8th century were becoming, by the 11th century, something different. More settled, more organized, more willing to negotiate and compromise. The Viking Age was ending not in a single dramatic moment but in this gradual transformation, as Norse people found new ways to achieve wealth and security that didn't depend on the edge of a sword. But for nearly 3 centuries, Norse raiders had reshaped the political map of Europe. They had brought down kingdoms, founded new ones, extracted unfathomable wealth from terrified victims. They had proven that skill at sea, courage in battle, and the right technology could allow a relatively small population from the far north to project power across enormous distances. The longships that had made it all possible still sat drawn up on beaches, still carried men to distant shores. But increasingly, those men were traders rather than raiders, settlers rather than warriors. The age of the Viking raid was passing. Something new was being born from it, something that would carry Norse influence forward in different forms, woven into the fabric of medieval Europe in ways that would last long after the last dragon-proud ship had rotted away. The image of the Viking as a raider, fierce and destructive, is only part of the story. Perhaps not even the most important part. For every warrior who went raiding, there were Norse merchants traveling vast trade routes, establishing connections that spanned from the frozen north to the deserts of the Middle East. For every violent conquest, there were peaceful settlements where Norse families built new lives in foreign lands. The Norse were explorers who pushed into unknown waters, settlers who established communities in some of the most remote and challenging environments on Earth. Trade was the lifeblood of Norse expansion. Yes, raiding brought sudden wealth, but trade built lasting prosperity. Norse merchants dealt in an extraordinary variety of goods, each item representing connections across vast distances and different worlds. Furs from the far north, thick pelts of fox and marten and beaver, luxurious and warm, highly prized in the markets of Europe and beyond. Iron, that essential metal, smelted from bog deposits and worked by skilled Norse smiths. Amber, that golden fossilized resin found along Baltic shores, treasured since ancient times for its beauty. Walrus ivory, harvested in the far northern reaches, so valuable that it rivaled elephant ivory from Africa in the luxury markets of medieval Europe. And slaves. We cannot ignore this. The slave trade was a major component of Norse commerce, a dark foundation beneath much of their prosperity. People captured in raids, bought in markets, transported in chains to be sold elsewhere. The trade routes that carried amber and furs also carried human beings torn from their homes and families. In Verdun, a major slave market, some enslaved people were castrated to serve as eunuchs in Islamic courts and households, a practice of horrific cruelty that met a specific market demand. The trade networks Norse merchants operated within were truly remarkable in their extent. Consider Birka, a trading settlement in what is now Sweden. Archaeological evidence shows goods from the Abbasid Caliphate, the great Islamic empire centered in Baghdad, making their way to this northern outpost. How did items travel such distances? Through interconnected trade routes, goods passing from merchant to merchant, carried by ship and pack animal, crossing borders and cultures. The Volga route was one such pathway. Norse traders, whom the eastern peoples called Rus, traveled down the great rivers of what is now Russia. The Volga flowed south, eventually reaching the Caspian Sea and providing connections to the Islamic world. Norse merchants made the long journey, their ships laden with northern goods, seeking the silver that flowed so abundantly in Islamic lands. That silver, in the form of Islamic dirhams, coins minted far to the south, appears in enormous hoards buried in Scandinavia. Someone would accumulate wealth in silver coins, bury it for safekeeping, and then never return to retrieve it. Perhaps they died unexpectedly, perhaps the location was forgotten, perhaps they fled never to return. Whatever the reason, these hoards remained in the ground for 1,000 years, waiting for modern archaeologists to discover them and puzzle over why someone in Sweden or Denmark or Norway possessed coins from Baghdad. The trade in walrus ivory deserves special attention. As elephant ivory became scarcer and more expensive in medieval Europe, walrus ivory from the far north became an increasingly important substitute. Norse hunters traveled to the edges of the Arctic, to the coasts of Greenland and beyond, hunting these massive creatures for their tusks. The ivory would then travel south through trade networks, eventually becoming ornate carvings in the hands of European craftsmen. This wasn't a small-scale operation. The demand was such that walrus hunting became a major industry, one of the economic foundations of Norse settlements in the far north. Even something as simple as a game board could be a trade good. Onoffertafel, the Norse strategy game, had boards that were crafted and traded, luxury items that combined entertainment with artistry. Trade wasn't only about essential goods or high-value luxuries. It encompassed the full range of human material culture. The river systems of Eastern Europe became Norse highways. These waterways allowed relatively easy travel deep into the continent, providing access to markets and peoples that would have been unreachable by sea. Norse traders became familiar figures along these routes, establishing settlements at key points, intermarrying with local populations, creating the connections that would eventually help form the early Russian states. The Norse groups who settled in the east, particularly along the rivers leading to Byzantium, played a crucial role in state formation. The term Rus itself, which would eventually give its name to Russia, may derive from a Norse word. These Eastern Norse weren't conquerors in the traditional sense but rather a ruling elite who organized trade and defense, who provided the structure around which early states coalesced. Over time, they would be absorbed into the Slavic populations they ruled, but their influence left permanent marks on the region's development. Byzantium, that glittering remnant of the Roman Empire, drew Norse warriors and traders like a magnet. Around 860, the Byzantine emperors began hiring Norse warriors as elite guards, a force that would become known as the Varangian Guard. These were some of the finest warriors of the age, sworn to protect the emperor himself, armed with their distinctive Dane axes, long-handled weapons that could cleave through armor. Service in the Varangian Guard was prestigious and lucrative, an opportunity for a young Norse warrior to win both wealth and fame. Westward, Norse settlement took different forms. York, ancient English city, became Jorvik under Norse rule, a thriving urban centre where Norse and English cultures blended. The city minted its own coins, a sign of economic sophistication and political stability. Archaeological excavations of Viking Age Jorvik reveal a cosmopolitan place, with goods from across the known world, craftsmen working in bone and metal and leather, a population engaged in trade and manufacture on an impressive scale. In Ireland, Norse settlers founded towns where none had existed before. Dublin, now the capital of Ireland, began as a Norse settlement in the 9th century. The Irish had been a largely rural society. The Norse brought urbanization, establishing market towns that drew people from the surrounding countryside, creating centers of commerce and craft production. Over time, these Norse foundations would become thoroughly Irish, but their origins lay in those initial settlements of Norse traders and warriors. The Faroe Islands, lonely rocks in the North Atlantic, saw Norse settlement around 825. These were barely habitable islands, windswept and isolated, but they offered grazing for sheep and a base for fishing. Norse settlers made lives there, adapting to the harsh conditions, creating communities that would maintain their Norse character for centuries. Iceland represents perhaps the most remarkable Norse settlement story. In the late 9th century, Norse explorers reached this large island far to the west, a land of fire and ice, of volcanoes and glacier, unlike anywhere they had known before. It was uninhabited except possibly for a few Irish monks who had arrived earlier seeking isolation for their prayers. The Norse saw opportunity. Settlement of Iceland proceeded rapidly. Within a few decades, much of the habitable land had been claimed. The settlers brought with them the full apparatus of Norse society, the Thing system of governance, their religious practices, their social hierarchies. They also brought thralls, enslaved people who constituted perhaps 30% of Iceland's population, providing the labor that made farming viable in such difficult conditions. Iceland became a crucible of Norse culture in some ways, preserved more purely there than in Scandinavia itself, which was increasingly influenced by Christianity and continental European culture. The sagas, those great prose narratives of Norse heroic age, would be written down in Iceland. The preservation of Norse mythology and tradition owes much to Iceland's isolation and its inhabitants' dedication to remembering. From Iceland, the pattern of westward exploration continued. In the late 10th century, Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for killing, explored the coasts of Greenland. He found the southwestern coast, though harsh, to be habitable. The name Greenland itself was marketing, an attempt to make the island sound appealing to potential settlers. It worked. Norse settlers established two main colonies in Greenland, bringing sheep and cattle, building turf houses in the Norse style, creating a European outpost at the very edge of the habitable world. These Greenland settlements would endure for centuries, always precarious, always dependent on trade with Iceland and Norway for essential goods they couldn't produce themselves. The walrus ivory trade sustained them economically. But they were vulnerable to climate shifts, to disruption of trade routes, to the countless dangers of living so far from help. Eventually, centuries later, the settlements would fail, the inhabitants dying or abandoning their homes, leaving behind ruins and mysteries for future archaeologists. But before that end came, Greenland Norse explorers pushed even farther west. Around the year 1000, they reached the coast of North America. Vinland, they called it, the land of wine or possibly meadows. They established at least one settlement, at a place we now call Lance Auxiliary Meadows in Newfoundland. turf longhouses in the Norse style, unmistakably Scandinavian in construction, prove that Norse people lived here, however briefly. Lance Auxiliary Meadows was probably not Vinland itself but rather a base for exploring farther south. The settlement was small, likely occupied for only a few years. The saga accounts speak of conflict with the indigenous peoples, of difficulties and dangers that made permanent settlement impossible. Whatever the full story, the Norse abandoned their North American ventures and did not return. For 500 years, their brief presence would be forgotten, remembered only in sagas that most people dismissed as fantasy until archaeology proved them true. DNA studies of modern populations reveal fascinating patterns of Norse settlement. In Iceland particularly, the genetic evidence suggests that while the male settlers were predominantly Norse, many of the women were Celtic, likely from Ireland or Scotland. This pattern suggests that Norse men traveled west with Celtic wives or partners, creating from the beginning a mixed population that was genetically diverse even as it maintained Norse cultural identity. Everywhere the Norse settled, they influenced and were influenced by local cultures. Place names across northern England, Scotland, Ireland, and beyond reflect Norse linguistic influence. Legal terms, especially in areas that were under Norse control, often derive from Old Norse. Artistic styles blended Norse and local elements. The Norse weren't simply imposing their culture on conquered peoples but rather creating new hybrid cultures through interaction, intermarriage, and gradual cultural exchange. York spoke a mixture of Norse and English. Dublin celebrated both Norse and Irish traditions. The Dane law in England operated under Norse law but with increasing English influence over time. Iceland maintained the purest Norse culture, but even there, the Celtic influence, especially from Irish slaves and settlers, left its mark. This capacity for cultural adaptation, this willingness to settle and blend with local populations rather than simply extracting wealth and leaving, distinguishes much of Norse expansion from other contemporary movements. The Norse could be brutal conquerors, certainly, but they could also be pragmatic settlers, willing to make new lives in new lands, to adopt useful practices from their neighbors, to create something new from the mixture of Norse and native cultures. The extent of Norse travel and settlement is still being discovered. Trade goods of Norse origin turn up in unexpected places. Linguistic influences appear in surprising contexts. The web of connections that Norse traders and explorers created stretched from North America to Central Asia, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. This wasn't an empire in the traditional sense, with central control and organized administration, but rather a network, a diaspora, connected by ships and shared culture and family ties. As you drift toward sleep, imagine those ships, always the ships, carrying not just raiders but traders with holds full of goods, settlers with their families and possessions, explorers seeking new lands beyond the horizon. Imagine the Norse merchant in a market in Baghdad, far from his northern home, negotiating in halting Arabic for silver coins. Imagine the settler in Iceland, looking out at a volcanic landscape unlike anything in Scandinavia, deciding this strange place would be home. Imagine the explorer sighting the coast of North America, wondering what lay beyond that tree line, whether this new land could become another Iceland, another opportunity. The Norse were restless, always looking beyond the next wave, the next headland, the next horizon. That restlessness drove them to the ends of the earth, left their mark on cultures and places that would remember them long after the last longship had sailed. Not just as raiders, though they were that. Not just as warriors, though they were that too. But as traders, explorers, settlers, as people seeking opportunity, building new lives, creating connections that spanned the known world and reached beyond it into lands Europeans wouldn't officially discover for another 5 centuries. In the quiet darkness before sleep, let us turn to the inner world of the Norse people, their beliefs about the cosmos, about the gods who shaped their world, about fate and destiny and the nature of existence itself. This was a people who saw the universe very differently than we do, who populated the world with powers and beings both wonderful and terrible, who understood their place in a cosmic drama that would end in fire and renewal. The Norse followed what we now call Old Norse religion, a polytheistic system with many gods, each with their own domains, their own stories, their own relationships with humanity. These weren't distant, abstract deities but rather personalities, beings who could be bargained with, honored, even questioned. The gods were powerful but not omnipotent, wise but not all-knowing, immortal but destined to die at the end of days. Odin, the Allfather, stood at the center of the Norse pantheon. He was a god of many contradictions, a wanderer and a king, a seeker of wisdom and a master of war, a god who had sacrificed his own eye for knowledge, who had hung on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights to learn the secrets of the runes. Odin gathered the bravest slain warriors to his hall, Valhalla, preparing an army for the final battle that must come. He was associated with poetry and magic, with the aristocracy and with kings. To be chosen by Odin was both honor and doom, for his favor was fickle and his purposes often dark. Thor, Odin's son, was perhaps the most beloved of the gods. The thunder god, wielder of the hammer Mjolnir, protector of humanity against the giants who threatened the ordered world. Thor was straightforward where Odin was cunning, strong where Odin relied on guile. The common people especially revered Thor, the defender, the god who could be counted on to stand between humans and the chaotic forces of the cosmos. When thunder rolled across the sky, people knew Thor was abroad, fighting giants, protecting Midgard, the world of humans. Frey was a god of fertility, of prosperity, of peace and good harvests. In a harsh land where farming was always uncertain, where failed crops meant starvation, Frey's importance cannot be overstated. He represented the bounty of the earth, the continuation of life, the cycles of growth and plenty. Freyja, the goddess, was powerful in her own right, associated with love and beauty but also with war and death. She was said to receive half of the slain warriors, choosing before Odin claimed his share. Freyja led the Valkyries in some accounts, those supernatural women who rode through the sky choosing the slain on battlefields. She practiced Sida, a form of magic associated with prophecy and fate manipulation, powerful but also somewhat suspect in a society that valued straightforward martial valor. Loki stands apart from the other gods, a trickster figure whose relationship with the divine realm was always complicated. Sometimes he helped the gods, using his cunning to solve problems. Sometimes he created disasters through his malice or carelessness. Loki was the father of monsters, the wolf Fenrir who would kill Odin at Ragnarok, the world serpent Jormungandr who encircled the earth, the goddess Hel who ruled the realm of the dead. He was necessary to the gods but ultimately would betray them, binding his fate to the destruction of all things. The Norse cosmos itself was imagined as a complex structure of interconnected worlds. At the center stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense ash whose roots and branches connected all the realms of existence. The tree was constantly threatened, gnawed by creatures, yet it endured, holding the worlds together through its living strength. 9 worlds existed in this cosmology, arranged in a pattern that made sense to Norse thought if not to modern physics. Asgard, home of the gods. Midgard, the Middle-earth where humans lived. Jotunheim, realm of the giants. Niflheim, a world of ice and mist. Muspelheim, a world of fire. and others, each with their own inhabitants and nature. These worlds weren't separate planets but rather different aspects of reality, connected by Yggdrasil, sometimes accessible to travelers who knew the way. Fate, that most crucial of concepts, was woven by the Norns, three mysterious female beings who sat at the base of Yggdrasil and spun the threads of destiny for gods and mortals alike. Their names were Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, roughly representing past, present, and future. The Norse believed that fate was real and inescapable. Even the gods could not alter what the Norns had decreed. This created a worldview that combined fatalism with fierce determination. You couldn't change your fate, but you could face it with courage. You could choose how you met what was destined to come. Valhalla, Odin's Hall of the Slain, captured the Norse imagination. Warriors who died bravely in battle might be chosen by the Valkyries, carried to this great hall where they would feast and fight eternally, preparing for Ragnarok. Each day they would battle, each evening they would be restored, drinking mead and eating the flesh of a boar that renewed itself each night. This was the afterlife that ambitious warriors hoped for, not peace but eternal preparation for the greatest battle of all. But Valhalla wasn't the only afterlife. Most people, those who died of sickness or old age, went to Hell's realm, which wasn't necessarily a place of punishment but simply where the dead resided. The Norse conception of the afterlife was more complicated than simply heaven and hell, with multiple possible destinations depending on how and why you died. Female spirits called Disir were venerated as ancestor guardians, protective beings associated with particular families or places. These weren't gods but rather something between spirits and deified ancestors, beings who took interest in their descendants' well-being and who should be honored appropriately. Religious practice involved sacrifices called blots, particularly at important times of year like Yule, the winter festival. Animals would be ritually killed, their blood sprinkled on altars and people, their meat consumed in communal feasts. These weren't somber church services but rather celebrations, gatherings of the community to honor the gods and request their favor. Sacred sites were often outdoors, in groves or near unusual natural features, though some communities built special halls for worship. Temple rings, sacred objects sworn upon when making oaths, gave supernatural weight to promises. To break an oath sworn on a temple ring was to invite divine punishment, to mark yourself as utterly untrustworthy. Magic permeated Norse religious practice. Cider, in particular, was a form of magic associated with prophecy and fate manipulation, typically practiced by women. A cider practitioner, often called a Volva or Siris, would enter trance states to see the future or communicate with spirits. She carried a staff as a symbol of her power and status. Communities would sometimes invite Sirises to perform rituals, seeking knowledge of what was to come, though there was always some ambivalence about such practices. Cider was powerful but also somewhat suspect, associated with a kind of power that made some Norse people uncomfortable. Runes carried magical as well as practical significance. The Helm of Or, a particular runic symbol, was believed to offer protection in battle, to strike fear into enemies. Warriors might trace such symbols on their weapons or armor, calling on the power that runes represented. The myths that we know today come from sources written down centuries after the Viking Age, primarily in Christian Iceland. How accurately they reflect the actual beliefs of pre-Christian Norse people remains debated. But certain themes seem fundamental: the creation of the world from the body of a primordial giant, the constant struggle between order and chaos, between the gods and the forces that threatened them, and ultimately the inevitability of Ragnarok. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the final destruction, was a central element of Norse mythology. The myths foretold that a time would come when the bonds holding back chaos would break. Fenrir the wolf would break free and devour Odin. The world serpent Jormungandr would rise from the ocean, and Thor would kill it but die from its poison. Loki would lead the forces of destruction against the gods. Fire and flood would consume the world. Nearly all the gods would die. Nearly all of humanity would perish. But Ragnarok wasn't quite the end. After the destruction, the myths said, the world would rise again from the waters, green and fresh. A few gods would survive. 2 humans, sheltered during the cataclysm, would emerge to repopulate the earth. From ending came new beginning, from destruction came renewal. This cyclical view of time, the understanding that destruction and creation were intertwined, shaped how the Norse understood their existence. Religious practice varied considerably across the Norse world. What was done in Norway might differ from Swedish practice. Local gods and spirits received veneration in some places but not others. There was no single orthodox belief system, no religious authority dictating correct practice. Communities and individuals approached the divine in their own ways, maintaining traditions they felt were important while adapting to local circumstances. The sagas preserve glimpses of these varied practices. The Eyrbyggja saga speaks of Draga, the undead who walked after death, dangerous beings who had to be dealt with through specific rituals. These weren't Christian concepts of the damned but rather Norse understanding of how death could go wrong, how the dead might not rest properly and become threats to the living. As Christianity began to spread into Scandinavia, we see interesting responses from those who held to the old ways. Thor's hammer pendants became more common after Christian missionary activity increased, as if people were asserting their traditional beliefs in response to the new religion. These small silver or bronze hammers, worn as jewelry, declared the wearer's allegiance to Thor and by extension to the old gods. Missionary efforts began earlier than many realize. Ansgar, a Frankish missionary, visited Birka in Sweden as early as 829, attempting to convert the Norse to Christianity. He had limited success. The Norse weren't particularly interested in abandoning their gods for a foreign religion that demanded exclusive worship. But the seeds were planted, and over the following centuries, Christianity would gradually, sometimes violently, replace the old religion. The conversion process was long and complicated, varying by region. Norway's conversion involved considerable coercion by Christian kings. Sweden resisted longer. Iceland's conversion in the year 1000 was decided by vote at the Althing, a pragmatic decision to avoid civil war between Christian and pagan factions. Even after official conversion, many old practices persisted, blended with Christianity, or continued in modified form. What the Norse believed about existence, about their place in the cosmos, shaped how they lived. If fate was real and inescapable, then courage in facing it became the highest virtue. If the gods themselves would die at Ragnarok, then mortality wasn't shameful but simply the nature of existence. If the world operated through cycles of destruction and renewal, then disaster wasn't an ending but a transformation. The gods weren't perfect beings to be emulated without question but rather powerful entities with their own flaws and limitations. Odin could be deceptive. Thor could be foolish. The gods quarreled among themselves, made mistakes, suffered consequences. This created a religious worldview that was surprisingly pragmatic. You honored the gods and sought their favor, but you didn't expect them to solve all your problems. You lived your life, faced your fate, and hoped to do so with enough courage and honor to be remembered. Magic and prophecy offered ways to glimpse what was coming, perhaps to influence fate at the margins, but ultimately what would be would be. The Volva might see the future in her trance, might speak words of prophecy that communities would remember and debate, but even her sight couldn't alter the fundamental pattern that the Norns had woven. As you drift deeper toward sleep, imagine the world tree Yggdrasil, its branches stretching into the heavens, its roots delving into mysterious realms below. Imagine the gods in their halls, feasting and planning, always aware that their time was limited, that Ragnarok would come. Imagine the Cirrus with her staff, entering trance to speak with spirits and see what lay hidden. Imagine the community gathered for the blot sacrifice, blood sprinkled on the altar, meat roasting, songs sung in honor of the gods who had shaped the world and who one day would die defending it. This was the spiritual landscape the Norse inhabited, a world alive with meaning and power, where the divine was near and the boundary between natural and supernatural was porous and constantly crossed. Their myths gave them ways to understand suffering and death, courage and cowardice, the nature of the cosmos and their place within it. When the Viking warrior went into battle, when the farmer planted his crops, when the mother nursed her child, they did so within this mythic framework, this understanding of existence that stretched from the creation of the world to its eventual destruction and renewal. The old gods are gone now, or transformed into literary figures, folklore, symbols deployed in modern contexts far removed from their original meanings. But for centuries they were real to the people who honored them, as real as the storms that Thor's hammer made, as real as the fate that the Norns wove, as real as the promise that brave warriors would feast eternally in Valhalla. That belief shaped a culture, inspired courage, and gave meaning to lives lived in a harsh and often unforgiving world. The world was changing. The old gods who had guided the Norse people for centuries were being challenged by a new faith, one that demanded exclusive devotion, that promised salvation rather than fate, that brought with it new forms of power and organization. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity was not a sudden transformation but a long, complex process that unfolded over generations, sometimes peaceful, often violent, always politically charged. Christian missionaries had been working among Scandinavian elites since the early Viking Age. These were brave men, venturing into lands where their God was unknown, where the people followed traditions stretching back into the mists of time. The missionaries faced skepticism, sometimes hostility, but they persisted. They understood that converting kings and jarls was the key. If the powerful adopted Christianity, their people would follow, whether willingly or otherwise. Some rulers saw advantage in the new faith. Christianity was the religion of the Frankish Empire, of England, of the major powers that surrounded Scandinavia. To be Christian was to be part of that world, to have legitimacy in the eyes of Christian rulers, to make alliances and trade agreements easier. There were practical, political reasons to convert that had little to do with genuine spiritual conviction. Gorm the Old, king in Denmark, held to the old ways. He was pagan, as his fathers had been, as tradition demanded. But his son Harold, who would be called Bluetooth, saw things differently. Harold converted to Christianity, embracing the new faith and bringing his kingdom with him. The famous Jelling stones, massive rune stones raised at the royal center of Jelling, proclaim Harold's achievement. He had made the Danes Christian. He had unified Denmark. He had established his realm as a Christian kingdom recognized by the wider European world. Underneath one of these rune stones, archaeologists found something remarkable, a church, built in the Christian style, marking the transition from the old ways to the new. The stone above proclaimed the conversion. The church below provided the space for the new worship. Together they announced that Denmark had changed, that the old gods were being set aside, that a new era had begun. In Sweden, King Olaf Skotkonung minted coins bearing the Christian cross. This wasn't just religious symbolism but a political statement. Coinage was a mark of sovereignty, of royal authority. To place the cross on coins was to declare that Sweden was now part of Christian Europe, that its king ruled by Christian right, that the old arrangements were being replaced by new ones. Iceland's conversion came through a remarkable decision. In the year 1000, at the Althing, the assembled free men faced a crisis. The island was dividing between Christians and those who held to the old gods. Civil war threatened. The law speaker Thorgeir was asked to decide. He retreated to his booth, covered himself with a cloak, and lay thinking for a day and a night. When he emerged, he announced his decision. Iceland would become Christian. Everyone would be baptized. But in private, people could still sacrifice to the old gods if they wished. It was a compromise, a pragmatic solution that avoided bloodshed while officially bringing Iceland into the Christian fold. Over time, of course, the private practice of the old religion would fade, but for the moment, Thorgeir had found a way to preserve peace while accepting the inevitable. Not all conversions were so peaceful. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason took a different approach. He enforced baptism by the sword. Convert or die. Convert or be exiled. Convert or face the king's wrath. Olaf was a zealot, convinced of the rightness of his cause, willing to use violence to bring his people to Christ. He traveled through Norway destroying temples, forcing baptisms, punishing those who resisted. His methods created resentment, resistance, but they also worked, after a fashion. Norway became Christian, though the cost in lives and social disruption was considerable. Another Olaf, Olaf Haraldsson, would become Norway's patron saint. He too worked to Christianize Norway, continuing the process Olaf Tryggvason had begun. In 1030, at the Battle of Stiklestad, Olaf Haraldsson died fighting against Norwegian nobles who opposed his rule. His death might have been the end of his influence, but something unexpected happened. Miracles were reported at his tomb. His body was said not to decay. Within a short time, Olaf was being venerated as a saint, a holy king who had died trying to bring Christianity to his people. His cult became a powerful force in completing Norway's Christianization. The Borgarthing, a major Norwegian assembly, formally banned heathen rites, making the old religion illegal. As Christianity spread, law codes began to change. The old oral traditions were being written down, but in the process, they were being modified to reflect Christian norms. Practices that had been acceptable under the old religion were now forbidden. Pagan sacrifices were banned. Christian marriage laws replaced older customs. The legal framework itself was being Christianized, blending Norse tradition with canon law, creating hybrid systems that drew from both traditions but increasingly privileged the Christian perspective. Churches rose across Scandinavia. At first these were small wooden structures, hardly different from other buildings. But as Christianity became established, as wealth flowed to the church through tithes, stone churches began to appear. These were impressive structures, built to last, physical manifestations of the new religion's permanence and power. Tithes, mandatory donations of a tenth of production, funded this building program. The church was becoming wealthy, a major landholder, an institution with resources to rival even kings. Bishoprics were established in major centers. These weren't just religious positions but political ones. Bishops advised kings, controlled significant resources, wielded authority over the faithful. Kings who controlled ecclesiastical appointments, who chose bishops and abbots, gained another lever of power over their realms. The connection between Christianity and royal power was obvious to everyone. Christian kingship came with new ideologies, new justifications for authority. A Christian king ruled by God's grace, not merely by strength and lineage. This gave kings additional legitimacy but also made them accountable, at least in theory, to Christian moral standards. The church could be an ally in consolidating royal power, but it could also be a constraint, limiting what kings could do without provoking ecclesiastical opposition. As Scandinavian rulers focused on building Christian kingdoms at home, the nature of Norse expansion changed. The Great Age of raiding was ending. Military campaigns now were less about raiding abroad for plunder and more about conflicts between emerging Scandinavian states, struggles between Christian kings for control of territory and resources. Svein Forkbeard of Denmark launched a conquest of England between 1013 and 1016. This wasn't a raid but an attempt to seize the English throne, to rule England as king. Svein succeeded briefly before his death, and his son Knut would complete what his father started. Knut the Great built an empire. He ruled Denmark, Norway, and England simultaneously, creating a North Sea empire that, had it lasted, might have fundamentally altered European history. Knut was a Christian king, ruling Christian lands by Christian right. He went on pilgrimage to Rome. He endowed churches. He presented himself as a pious monarch, the very model of a Christian ruler. The pagan raider was now a Christian king, indistinguishable in many ways from any other European monarch. But empires built by one man's skill and force of personality rarely survive their builder. After Knut's death in 1035, his realm fragmented. His sons couldn't hold what their father had created. By 1042, Edward the Confessor, of the Old English royal line, regained the English throne from Danish control. Knut's North Sea Empire dissolved, leaving Denmark and Norway and England as separate realms once more. The Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, where Olaf Haraldsson fell, marked more than just one king's death. It represented the transformation that was sweeping through Scandinavia. A Christian king had died fighting to consolidate Christian rule, and his death had been transformed into martyrdom, his body into relics, his memory into a saint's cult. The old gods offered Valhalla to slain warriors. Christianity offered sainthood and miracles. The competition between religions was being decided not just on battlefields but in the hearts and minds of people choosing between the old ways and the new. By the 11th century, the transformation was largely complete. Scandinavia was Christian. Churches dotted the landscape. Bishops advised kings. Monks copied manuscripts. The old gods were becoming folklore, stories told but no longer quite believed. Thor and Odin were fading into the past, replaced by Christ and the saints. This wasn't simply a change in which supernatural beings people appealed to for help. It was a fundamental transformation of society. Christian law replaced or modified old customs. The Church's emphasis on monogamy and indissoluble marriage changed family structures. The Christian calendar with its feast days and fasts reshaped the rhythm of the year. Literacy, brought by the Church, began to spread beyond a small elite. Latin, the language of the Church, connected Scandinavia to the broader intellectual culture of medieval Europe. Trade patterns shifted too. Christian merchants preferred dealing with other Christians. Scandinavian traders who might have faced suspicion or hostility as pagans found doors opening once they shared the faith of their trading partners. Integration into Christian Europe brought economic advantages alongside spiritual and political ones. The monasteries that were founded in Scandinavia became centers of learning and culture. Monks preserved the old stories even as they promoted the new faith. Much of what we know about Norse mythology and Viking Age history comes from texts written by Christian monks and scholars in Iceland and elsewhere. They wrote in Latin and Old Norse, preserving traditions even as they interpreted them through Christian perspectives. The stave churches of Norway, wooden structures of remarkable beauty and craftsmanship, show the blending of Norse building traditions with Christian purposes. These churches used Norse woodworking techniques, incorporated decorative elements that echoed the old artistic styles, but housed Christian worship. They were physically emblematic of the synthesis that was occurring, new faith expressed through traditional forms. But the transition wasn't without losses. The old oral traditions began to fade. Without regular recitation at religious ceremonies, myths and stories were forgotten or reduced to fragments. The connection to the landscape, to sacred groves and holy sites, weakened as churches became the new focal points for religious activity. Skills associated with the old religion, the Circes' prophetic practices, the magic rituals, were pushed underground or disappeared entirely. Some resisted. We hear occasional references to people clinging to the old ways, refusing baptism, maintaining secret sacrifices. But these were increasingly marginal figures, holdouts against an inevitable tide. The social pressure, the legal requirements, the economic and political advantages of conforming, all pushed toward acceptance of Christianity. Within a few generations, active belief in the old gods largely ceased, except in the most remote areas. Kings grew stronger through this process. The church provided administrative support, literate clerks who could keep records and draft documents. Christian kingship came with models and expectations drawn from continental European practice. The thing system didn't disappear immediately, but royal authority increasingly overshadowed these traditional assemblies. The balance of power was shifting toward centralized monarchy. By 1100, the transformation was essentially complete. Scandinavia was Christian. The Viking Age was over. The descendants of raiders and pagans were now Christian kings ruling Christian peoples, integrated into the political and religious structures of medieval Europe. Diplomatic marriages connected Norse dynasties to other European royal houses. Norse warriors served as mercenaries in Christian armies rather than raiding Christian lands. The energy that had driven Norse expansion outward was now channeled into building kingdoms at home, into conflicts between Christian Scandinavian states rather than raids against Christian Europe. The world the Vikings had known, a world of many gods and flexible fate, of honor won by the sword and wealth taken by force, of independence and local autonomy, that world was fading. In its place arose a world of one God and eternal judgment, of law codes and ecclesiastical authority, of monarchy and hierarchy. It was a profound transformation, achieved over several generations through a complex mixture of genuine conversion, political calculation, violence, and gradual cultural change. As sleep draws nearer, imagine the old temples being torn down, the sacred groves cut and burned. Imagine the first churches rising, their crosses strange against the northern sky. Imagine an old warrior, baptized late in life to please his king, muttering prayers to Thor under his breath even as he makes the sign of the cross. Imagine the young people who had never known the old ways, for whom Christianity was simply what everyone believed, the past already becoming legend. The gods did not die at Ragnarok as the myths foretold. They faded into memory, replaced by a new God who promised different things, who demanded different worship, who brought with him an entire civilization's worth of learning and law and custom. The Norse people survived this transformation, adapted to it, eventually embraced it. But something was lost in the process, something that would only be imperfectly recovered centuries later when scholars began piecing together fragments of what the old religion had been, what the Vikings had believed before the White Christ came north. As we reach the end of our journey through the Viking world, we must pause and consider how we know what we know, how the past reaches us across the gulf of centuries, filtered through layers of interpretation, shaped by those who chose to remember and record. The Vikings left traces, some intentional, others accidental, and from these fragments we reconstruct their world. Much of the narrative richness we associate with the Vikings comes from the Icelandic sagas, extraordinary works of medieval literature written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, long after the Viking Age had ended. These sagas tell stories of kings and heroes, of family feuds and voyages to distant lands, of honor and betrayal and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Heimskringla, written by the Icelandic scholar and politician Snorri Sturluson, chronicles the kings of Norway from legendary times through the 12th century. It's a masterwork of medieval historical writing, filled with vivid characters and dramatic events. Egil's saga tells the life of Egil Skallagrimsson, a poet-warrior whose story encompasses both brutal violence and sophisticated verse composition, embodying the contradictions of Norse culture. These sagas are wonderful, compelling, beautifully crafted, rich in detail. But they present problems for historians. They were written centuries after the events they describe, during the Christian period, by authors who had their own agendas and literary purposes. They mix what may be genuine historical memory with legend, with pure invention, with archaic attempts to imagine how people in earlier times might have lived and thought. We cannot simply accept the sagas as straightforward history. A saga's account of a battle or a voyage might contain some kernel of truth, but it has been elaborated, dramatized, perhaps altered completely in the retelling and eventual writing down. Scholars must approach these texts cautiously, comparing them against other sources, using them carefully to understand not just what happened but what later Icelanders believed or wanted to believe had happened. More reliable as contemporary evidence are the runestones scattered across Scandinavia. Over 5,000 of these carved stones survive in Sweden alone, with many more in Norway and Denmark. These stones were raised to commemorate individuals, to record voyages, to mark accomplishments. They give us names, relationships, destinations. Thorstein raised this stone in memory of his brother Sven, who died in England. Simple words, carved in stone, but they tell us someone real named Thorstein mourned someone real named Sven who traveled to England and never returned. These aren't legends or literary inventions but grief made tangible, memory preserved for future generations. The runestones rarely tell us details we wish we knew. They don't explain why Sven went to England or how he died or what he was like as a person. But they confirm that Norse people traveled widely, that they wanted to be remembered, that family bonds mattered enough to invest considerable effort in raising stones that would last. Language itself preserves Viking influence. In Britain and Ireland, place names reveal where Norse people settled. The Danelaw region of eastern England is thick with place names ending in by, meaning farm or settlement, or thorp, meaning village. Grimsby, Whitby, Derby, these names mark Norse foundations or at least Norse influence. Linguistic analysis of English shows hundreds of words borrowed from Old Norse, so thoroughly integrated into the language that we rarely think about their origins. Sky, egg, knife, window, anger, awkward, all came into English from Norse. Medieval chroniclers outside Scandinavia left accounts of Viking raids and invasions. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Frankish Annals, Irish records, all document Norse activities from the perspective of those who suffered from them. These accounts are valuable but also biased. The chroniclers were often monks whose monasteries had been raided, or scribes working for kings who had paid massive tribute. They portrayed Vikings as brutal heathens, instruments of God's wrath sent to punish Christian sins. These chroniclers rarely had interest in presenting a balanced picture. They didn't write about Norse domestic life, about the traders and farmers who never raided anyone, about the complexity of Norse society and culture. For them, Vikings were raiders and invaders, and that was the story they told. Modern scholarship has worked to balance this picture. By combining archaeological evidence with careful reading of written sources, by examining trade goods and settlement patterns and genetic data, scholars have revealed Vikings as multifaceted people. Yes, they raided. Yes, they could be violent. But they were also farmers who struggled to feed their families, traders who built commercial networks spanning continents, craftspeople who created beautiful objects, parents who loved their children, people with the full range of human complexity. The popular image of Vikings, however, often lags behind scholarly understanding. The horned helmet, that iconic piece of Viking costume, is entirely a modern invention. It dates mainly from 19th-century Romanticism, particularly from costume designs for Wagner's Ring cycle operas in 1876. Real Viking helmets had no horns. But the image proved irresistible, and now it's almost impossible to dislodge from popular imagination. The Bayeux tapestry, that famous medieval embroidery depicting the Norman conquest of England, shows warriors who include Varangians, Norse warriors in Byzantine service. These figures give us some visual evidence of what Viking Age warriors actually looked like, and notably, none wear horned helmets. Archaeological work has revolutionized our understanding. The excavations at York in the 1970s, which led to the creation of the Jorvik Viking Center, revealed an entire urban settlement preserved beneath the modern city. The waterlogged conditions had preserved organic materials that normally decay, leather shoes, wooden bowls, even ancient feces that could be analyzed to understand diet and health. Suddenly, the Vikings became real in new ways, their daily lives visible in unprecedented detail. Reconstructed Viking ships have been built and sailed, testing whether medieval Norse vessels could really make the voyages attributed to them. The answer is yes, emphatically yes. These reconstructions have crossed the Atlantic, have demonstrated the remarkable seaworthiness of Norse ship designs. They've shown that the voyages described in sagas, however embellished the narratives might be, were physically possible, even probable. Reenactment groups and living history programs bring the Viking Age to life for modern audiences. People dress in carefully researched reproductions of Viking Age clothing, demonstrate crafts and combat techniques, cook historical recipes. These efforts serve education and entertainment, though they also risk creating their own kind of mythology, a cleaned-up, dramatized version of the past that may be more appealing than accurate. Museums across Scandinavia and beyond house Viking artifacts. The ship museums in Oslo and Roskilde display actual Viking vessels, preserved for over 1,000 years. To stand before these ships is to encounter the past tangibly, to see the craftsmanship that made Viking expansion possible. Jewelry, weapons, domestic items, all help us understand how Viking Age people lived. Genetic studies have added yet another dimension to our understanding. DNA analysis of modern populations reveals Viking genetic legacy. In Britain, between 6 and 20% of the male population carries Y chromosome markers associated with Norse ancestry, with higher concentrations in areas historically under Norse control. Female genetic lines also show Norse influence, confirming that Viking settlement involved families, not just male warriors. These studies also reveal unexpected complexity. The Vikings themselves were genetically diverse, not a single population but people from across Scandinavia and beyond. Some Vikings had significant Southern European ancestry. Some had Sami heritage. The genetic evidence confirms what other sources suggest: the Viking world was cosmopolitan, connected, mixed. UNESCO has recognized Lance Auxiliary Meadows, that Norse settlement in Newfoundland, as a World Heritage Site, acknowledging its importance as evidence of pre-Columbian European contact with North America. The site draws visitors who want to see where Vikings briefly established themselves in the New World, 5 centuries before Columbus sailed. Modern popular culture continues to reimagine Vikings. Marvel's Thor movies draw loosely from Norse mythology while creating something entirely new. Television series like Vikings blend historical elements with dramatic invention. Video games set in Viking worlds let players explore fantasy versions of Norse culture. These modern interpretations rarely aim for historical accuracy, but they demonstrate the continuing fascination with Vikings, the sense that these people from over 1,000 years ago still capture something in the modern imagination. The word Viking itself has become detached from its historical meaning. It's a brand name, a sports team mascot, a shorthand for toughness or independence or exploration. Minnesota's NFL team, metal bands, cruise lines, various products, all use Viking imagery. The historical Vikings have been transformed into a cultural symbol that often has little to do with the actual people of medieval Scandinavia. This creates tension. Scholars work to understand the historical reality while popular culture creates and recreates Vikings in forms that serve modern purposes. Both are valid in their way, but they aren't the same thing. The Vikings of scholarly research, complex, contradictory, products of their time and place, differ substantially from the Vikings of popular imagination. There's also the uncomfortable reality that Viking imagery has sometimes been appropriated by groups promoting ideologies the historical Norse people never held. White supremacists have tried to claim Vikings as symbols of racial purity, ignoring all evidence of Viking diversity and cosmopolitanism. This misuse of history requires pushback, requires scholars and educators to emphasize that the real Vikings don't support these modern prejudices. Memory is always selective. The Vikings are remembered for their raids and explorations, their ships and their warriors. Less remembered are the thousands of ordinary lives, the farmers who never left their valleys, the children who died young, the women managing households, the enslaved people whose names we'll never know. History privileges the dramatic and the well-documented, leaving vast ranges of human experience in shadow. What survives from the Viking Age is a fraction of what existed. Most objects have decayed. Most words were never written down. Most lives left no record. We work with fragments, with survival bias, with evidence that comes to us through complex chains of transmission and preservation. The Vikings we can study are the ones who happen to leave traces, that happen to survive, that happen to be found and interpreted. And yet, from these fragments, a picture emerges. Not complete, not unbiased, but real nonetheless. Real people who lived in harsh northern lands, who developed remarkable ships, who ventured across seas and down rivers, who traded and raided and settled, who told stories and worshipped gods and raised families and built communities. People who were both like us and profoundly different, products of their own time and culture, understandable in some ways and alien in others. The Viking Age ended. The distinctive culture that had driven Norse expansion gradually transformed, absorbed Christianity, integrated into medieval European civilization. But echoes remained. The genetic legacy in populations. the linguistic influence on languages, the place names on maps, the artifacts in museums, the stories preserved in manuscripts, the runestones standing sentinel over landscapes that have changed beyond recognition since they were carved. We study Vikings because they matter to our understanding of medieval history, because their expansion reshaped Europe and touched distant shores. But also, perhaps, because they represent something appealing, people who ventured into the unknown, who faced harsh conditions with courage, who created beauty alongside violence, who left marks on the world that endure a millennium later. As sleep finally claims you, imagine those runestones, weathered but standing, their carved letters still readable after 1,000 years. Imagine the ships in museums, silent now but once alive with the creak of oars and the snap of sails. Imagine the genetic markers in modern DNA, invisible links to people who lived and died centuries ago. Imagine the place names on British road signs, Norse words still spoken in English accents by people who've never thought about their origins. The Vikings left. They're gone. But they're also still here, woven into the fabric of our world in ways obvious and subtle. In the languages we speak, in the genetic code we carry, in the stories we tell, in the fascination that draws us to study and imagine their world. Memory fades, but not entirely. The past isn't truly past. It's present in altered forms, echo and fragment, trace and legacy. And so we remember them. The raiders and traders. The explorers and settlers. The warriors and farmers. The poets and craftspeople. The men and women who lived their lives in cold northern lands and warmer southern ones, who faced their fates with whatever courage they could muster, who loved and fought and worked and died, who were for a time the terror and wonder of the medieval world. The Vikings. Neither heroes nor villains, but people. Complex, contradictory, fascinating people whose world we can glimpse imperfectly across the centuries, whose legacy continues to shape our own world in ways we're still discovering. May they rest in whatever afterlife they believed awaited them, and may we remember them with the balance and honesty they deserve, not as symbols or stereotypes, but as the complicated, real people they were. And now, our journey gently comes to a close. There's nothing you need to hold on to, nothing you need to remember, and nothing you need to think about. The stories of longships, distant shores, and quiet northern nights can slowly fade into the background. If your eyes are already heavy, you can let them rest. And if you drift off now, that's exactly as it should be. I'll be here with more calm histories, whenever you're ready to listen again. Good night, and rest well.